Welcome to The Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today and find out a little bit about their journey, the events that have shaped their career, and maybe what still keeps them up at night. Today's guest is Sounil Yu, a pioneering figure in cybersecurity whose frameworks and methodologies have fundamentally changed how many organizations approach security. He's the creator of the Cyber Defense Matrix and the DIE Triad, which we'll be talking about later, which has been widely adopted across not only industry, but even influenced federal policy. Currently serving as co-founder and CTO at Knostic, Sounil has previously held roles such as Chief Security Scientist at Bank of America and has over 3 decades of experience in pushing the boundaries of what's possible in cybersecurity thinking. Sounil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we just said in the intro, you've got over 3 decades of experience there.
Yes.
What first drew you into technology and this industry?
Well, I am pretty sure I would say, and when I was growing up in high school, I was definitely one of those geeks that gets stuffed into the locker and gets poked fun at. I was probably one of the very few people who really was playing around with computers and technology. I think I was on the internet as well, the equivalent of the internet as early as 1987-ish. So not very far after that time frame, I actually had an email, and I tell my wife, I've been using email for a long time, well before it became mainstream. So anyway, I've been in technology for a long time, and the progression I think a lot of us also had is that we help our parents or our friends with their computers. I used to run help desk at Duke University, and subsequently in my first job out of college was also doing help desk, and so that it set me on the path to where I am today.
And the help desk thing is a very common theme across guests on the podcast here. A lot of people starting the help desk. What do you think it is about working on the help desk that sets you up so well for a career in this industry?
Well, first of all, it helps you build character. It's sort of like it's the equivalent of flipping burgers at McDonald's, I think. It is definitely grueling work. It can be, a lot of people yell at you, they're unhappy. It helps. It is a customer service job, and I think just understanding the view of the customer is probably the one thing that I learned, and also how to work with customers in a way that doesn't worsen the situation. So again, it's a hard job when people are calling you because they something broke and they think it's your fault. So it's probably not too different from how we deal with cybersecurity, because guess what? When we roll out a cybersecurity control, it does break the environment, and it is our fault, and we gotta figure out a way to manage that. So I think cybersecurity and help desk, there's a lot of skills that you learn in help desk that directly contribute to a successful cybersecurity career.
And I believe you actually studied, was it electrical engineering first of all? You didn't go into...
Yes. Electrical engineering and economics, actually. And I actually minored in a whole bunch of other subjects, which I think one thing about cybersecurity is that the ones who are most successful are those who can have a broad range of experiences and context. And so I've had the opportunity to not just study electrical engineering and economics, but also essentially minored in a bunch of other topics like computer science, physics, psychology, sociology, and it's college for me was like an all-you-can-eat buffet, and so I ate as much as I could.
That's fantastic. I was curious because I'd seen the electrical engineering and the economics, and I was kind of thinking, what's the connection between these? I can think of like supply and demand in terms of both, but it was just for that broader perspective. Was there a real interest in economics as well, or was it just that, like you say, all-you-can-eat buffet, you just wanted to learn different perspectives on things?
So I would say if you are a risk manager, which of course many people in cybersecurity are, you really should actually study economics. Economics is probably at the crux of a lot of things. And the specific field of economics that I think is extraordinarily well suited for cybersecurity is the field of behavioral economics. And behavioral economics, a lot of it is about how we perceive and manage risk, which is exactly what we do, right? So I would say that economics is, in many respects, I would say economics is something that every cybersecurity practitioner should have some experience and understanding, because it's all about what are the incentives that drives human behaviors. So if you think about, for example, phishing, if you see it from the lens of economics, a lot of the common behaviors that we see that we're frustrated at can be better explained through the motivations and incentives and the triggers that we and that people see that causes them to click. Okay. And so the whole field of economics, I think, is fascinating, but the specific field of behavioral economics is one that I think is really, really closely tied to cybersecurity.
Yeah, it is a fascinating crossover that we come across time and time again when we're talking to guests around how to convey risk to management, to the board, to other people involved. And quite often those people have they have an economic focus. They're looking for, what's the cost of the business, what's the impact? And someone wants to, talk about a very technical issue they're very passionate about, but then can't always convey it in the terms of actually what does this mean for the business in terms of economics? What does this risk actually mean? So I think it's a really interesting area to cross over to and get that other perspective there.
Yeah, it's actually just not just to understand what risk means, but also, like for example, one of the my favorite authors in economics is Daniel Kahneman, and he and his researcher, co-collaborator, Amos Tversky, really kind of founded the whole field of behavioral economics and this notion of cognitive biases. And people, I'm sure, are familiar with the notion of cognitive biases, and they're showing up everywhere. But one cognitive bias is, for example, risk aversion. We tend to be more risk adverse than in terms of we want to avoid losing than gaining the exact same amount. Okay. So there's all these experiments that they ran, and the end result is that most of us tend to be risk adverse in terms of the options that we take. And so if we understand that basic principle of risk aversion being this sort of bias that we have towards risk aversion, then how do we refactor how we talk about what we do in cybersecurity to fit that bias? Essentially, how do we use those biases to our advantage? But at the same time, how do we avoid the pitfalls of falling into that bias when we make risk decisions as well?
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah. In terms of those early days at the university, it wasn't just the studying. You obviously were interested in other activities, including seeing if your friends were online on the university computing cluster, I believe. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you were up to with the university computing cluster and how an experiment of yours went a little sideways.
Sure. So one of my icebreaker questions that I typically, when we get together with friends and such or new people, one of my icebreaker questions is, what's the most damage that you've caused without getting fired? What's the most IT damage you've caused without getting fired? And yeah, I've been in IT for a long time, so there's some pretty bad stories. And my earliest one would be so there was a this was way before Instant Messenger, where in Instant Messenger you can go in and see who's online, right? Because there's a little green dot that says you're online. Well, back in the day, we didn't have such a thing. So I had this program where there was a program called Finger, where you can kind of basically poke an account and say, hey, are they online? And so I had a list of people that I just wanted to check if they were online. And so I created a Finger program that systematically checked these people. Now, I can only run it on a specific machine, so I needed to run it on multiple machines. And if it wasn't running on a machine, I would make sure that it runs on that machine. And I would have to have it run on multiple machines. Anyway, you can probably see where this is going, but I unintentionally created a worm that propagated to pretty much every computer every Unix system in the university. I think we're past the statute of limitations on this. So anyway, let's just say that they weren't too happy with this program. Fortunately, I think they saw it as innocuous and said, do not ever do this again. And it didn't. But they had to shut down the whole university system because of that.
Oh, and did they discover it was you that had done it? Was it linked back to yourself?
Yeah, that was one of my first lessons in OPSEC too.
Fantastic. And then obviously from that, creating that chaos, how did you then start to go from the help desk actually moving into the career? Because you've had quite an interesting range of roles.
Yeah. So after that, I spent time so I ran help desk at Duke University, ran that for the students, and that could have been a whole business. I was thinking, essentially, I ran an MSP, if you think about it. Could have been I guess I could have run an MSP early in my career. But instead of that, I actually did help desk for KPMG. And I could tell you some interesting disaster stories there for how badly I made a mistake and still didn't get fired. But that's it. After that, then I spent several years at Booz Allen as a consultant. And I thought actually that was some of the best training I got to be able to think quickly on your feet, to be able to synthesize content in a way that people could understand, to really get outside of the IT shell, so to speak, the geek shell, and to really understand how people really think and how they process information. So the one skill that I think I still that I really valued was, again, thinking quickly on your feet, but also presenting that or capturing that on a PowerPoint. And so I think a lot of people see, at least for the feedback I've gotten in some of the work that I've done, it's the PowerPoints that I create that really tell a good story. And I would say that experience came from consulting. So it's a great skill to have. It's a great, it's like for those who want to do dance, everyone learns ballet because ballet teaches you all the fundamental skills of how to dance. I think I don't know anything about dance, but that's what I've heard. I think consulting is the same sort of thing. It gives you all the fundamental skills for how to be a good communicator and even actually a good executive over time. Because one of the things I learned about consulting is this was the adage that I remember at Booz Allen: our most valuable assets leave the door every day, and we hope that they come back. And if you believe that as a company, then you're actually pouring a lot of time and energy and investment into your people. And I felt that very much so at Booz Allen. I would suspect that's going to be the same at most consulting companies because that's kind of that's what they're selling. And so the experience that I had there to be invested in as a person, to grow and to be to have the skills that I was able to gain, I thought it was a great experience. The other thing that was really amazing was that you don't get where we are with as a CISO, as a practitioner, we only see it from one vantage point. It gets very deep, but we only see it from one standpoint. Whereas when you're a consultant, you can see it from the vantage point of many other organizations, and you can pick the best of each one and understand the pitfalls of some of the challenges that these different organizations will have. So it was, again, really great experience, and one that I certainly, if I had to do it again, I would jump right into as well.
And then from there, you moved on to the role that I knew you in. I first came across you in, which is Bank of America. So, what made the decision to move out of that consultancy world into the role of a chief security scientist ultimately at Bank of America?
Yeah, so actually I was pulled in by a former colleague who was CISO at Bank of America at the time. And as they say, he gave me an offer that I couldn't refuse. And it was a fun, the way I described the job was, my job was to try to get fired every day. Which it's an interesting job because then the goal here is to really push the envelope around what the organization can do, and to offer this sort of continuously offer this outside view that challenges what are the current norms or status quo within an organization. Of course, in doing so, you don't necessarily when you call people's baby ugly, and of course you're trying to do this tactfully, but when your job is to essentially point out the flaws and to offer different ways of doing things, people who are ingrained in their approaches don't necessarily like that, right? People are comfortable with the status quo. And so my job as a disruptor, effectively, it kind of aligns with the notion of try to get fired every day. But anyway, that's it. That job came up because I was pulled in by a former colleague who saw me as a disruptor at Booz Allen, challenging our ways of thinking, bringing forth new products and new capabilities that the client services team. So I was client facing, and my job was to deliver new capabilities and services to our client base. And so my team at Booz Allen was basically doing that on an annual basis, building out new capabilities. And the CISO at Bank of America said, hey, come over to the bank and do the same.
And if someone's listening to podcast today thinking they're at a company where they feel they are stuck in the status quo, but can see lots of things that could be improved upon, how would you advise someone to go about trying to get fired without actually getting fired?
Well, the perspective is that the outside view is a really useful perspective. And when you have a newbie join the organization, they, of course, are bringing in an outside view. And that outside view, people should really listen to. Say, hey, that's a really interesting perspective, and don't dismiss it, right? And my view is, my perspective of trying to get fired every day, but not actually getting fired, is to constantly get that outside view, to offer that outside view. And one of the ways that I got that outside view myself was by talking to lots of other people outside of the organization. What are you doing? How are you doing this? What am I missing that I'm not seeing? And to always be open about that on a regular basis. Now, it could get overwhelming. And one easy way to describe how overwhelming it could be was like one of my tasks or one of my responsibilities, which is how we end up meeting, is to look at startups, right? My job was to look at startups, which is, of course, very much an outside view of the world. And I started at Bank of America in 2012, and I think that was roughly the inflection point when all of a sudden all these startups just started coming out of the woodworks. Cybersecurity startups started to come out of the woodworks. It was also roughly around the same time when the AI winter started to pass, and we started to go into AI spring. So again, tons of startups emerging that were taking advantage of AI, and tons of cybersecurity startups just because it became the hot thing. So I got plenty of outside view, and that outside view, I think, is something that if you can properly synthesize and deliver internally, you bring that value. You are creating disruption in perspectives that people have internally. But again, you're doing it with evidence, and you're doing it and hopefully in a tactful way that doesn't cause people to actually want to fire you.
And are there any specific examples of major challenges you've had in disrupting the way an organization approaches a particular thing?
Well, there's a lot, and I'm not sure if I want to call out specifics within the bank just because there are certain names attached and such, so on and so forth. But it is really going back to the economics conversation around earlier. There is an economics and psychology. Behavioral economics is a combination of economics and psychology, and the main lesson learned is, at the end of the day, these are people who are really trying to do their best job, right? We hire amazing people at every organization. The goal is to hire amazing people, and the amazing people that we hire, if you find that they're not doing their job, or there's something that diminishes their productivity or whatever else it is, one thing that I learned is to really take a step back and, again, think more broadly, have that outside view to say, what is it that is structurally creating these problems? Because it's not just the individual, it's there's an overall process or overall reason why some of these things are happening the way they are. I've gone into many organizations, again, either as a consultant or just looking at the deep recesses of the bank. You go in there and you're like, why is this so broken? And there's a whole story as to why it's so broken. And if we cast judgment too quickly on some of these things, we don't see the big picture. And so, again, the outside view is useful, but then when you marry that up with the inside view, the bigger story unfolds. But the outside view is still useful because you can say, okay, I think we've seen this problem before, and let's take a step outside of the jail that we put ourselves in and see what other possibilities exist.
And in those kind of roles as a consultant or in kind of internal disruptor, I guess one of the key challenges is picking your battles. There's usually, in any organization, there's no shortage of challenges to go and address. There's no shortage of problems out there. And there's that kind of thing of looking for the bigger picture and understanding it. And you must get to a point where you have to pick your battles. How do you decide which areas to focus on first and what to prioritize in your efforts?
Well, I don't know if I've mastered this by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a similar sort of discussion that we have when it comes to risk quantification in cybersecurity. Or how do I know which of these initiatives I should focus on when they all seem vitally important? And there is a bias that we typically have. It's going back to my comment about the cognitive biases in behavioral economics, but there's this thing called recency bias, which is we tend to bias those things. We tend to favor those things that we just recently read about in the news or just recently happened to us, and that overweights our thinking in terms of what's important. So the perspective here is, at the end of the day, the process of risk ranking or process of determining which hill do I really want to tackle is one that requires us to be more thoughtful and to take a step back and not be influenced just by the fact that this happened recently. My comment earlier about understanding these biases that we have and understanding how we think, how our brains think, ends up being a really useful mechanism to help us avoid some of the pitfalls of picking the wrong hill to die on, as well as what cybersecurity initiatives we should focus on. I can't reemphasize enough how important these sort of key principles are, not just for how we do cybersecurity, but also, fascinatingly enough, how it relates to AI itself. And some of the pitfalls that we see in AI, because the AI tools that we see today fall to the same exact biases, fall prey to the same biases. And so if we understand our own biases, we can then understand the biases that we'll see in these AI systems as well, and counter them.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective, because obviously we're often training the AI off data sets that are generated by humans. Humans have their own biases, and we've seen this come up in multiple spheres of AI. What are some of the mechanisms, and we'll come on to the AI stuff a bit more in detail later, but what are some of the key approaches to actually making sure that those biases don't appear in the AI?
I don't know if we can. There's an answer to that, which it's a more elaborate answer. But the way that we correct for errors. So first of all, let's talk about what these AI systems, or how our brain typically works. So there's this evolution of our brain where we started with basic steering. We move towards things that are positive, or we find something positive and move towards that thing that's positive. Then we go to reinforcement learning, where we say, okay, if I turn left, I get positive results, so I'm going to keep turning left. And most of our systems are today based on reinforcement learning principles, and that's why you hear the term reinforcement learning in a lot of things as well. But when it's based on reinforcement learning, there's no reason behind why I turn left. It's just because I get a reward. I can't explain anything. It's all based on statistical outcomes, and the bias that we see, again, it's not explainable. It's just because statistically, that's how things have unfolded. Now, the question of is this a correct outcome is not something that these reinforcement learning systems can properly do. But there is a mechanism that we employ as humans to do that. And it's a model of the world. Okay. And what it turns out is we have these models that help us understand a lot of complex topics. So earlier you mentioned supply and demand in economics. Once we understood supply and demand as a model for economics, it really reshaped economic theory and our understanding of economics. Before that, it was just people were just buying stuff, and for whatever reason, prices went up, and we don't know why. We couldn't explain why, but once we had a model, we could explain why that was the case. Now, all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's a famous quote by George Box. So the supply and demand model was useful, but it didn't quite fit every situation. So we had to come up with other models that also explain the world and how to interpret it properly. And so I think one thing that I've done over the course of my career is to really use these mental models to help shape my understanding of a lot of things that we encounter. And cybersecurity is certainly one of those things where it's a very complex topic. We don't really always understand what we're doing or why we're doing certain things. But if we can put a model to it, then it helps us understand correctness in a lot of things. So how do we get rid of bias? I don't think we can get rid of bias through the reinforcement learning techniques, but I do think we can get rid of bias when we start applying certain models to what we see. in whatever discipline we're talking about, and we can see correctness there.
And you mentioned the concept of mental models to help us in security. And one of the key things I associate you with is being kind of a cybersecurity philosopher, effectively, because you're out there wrestling with some of the fundamental questions around security. You're often challenging the status quo. You're taking the outsider's perspective, and then coming up with things like the cyber defense matrix, the DIE Triad. What was the motivation for you to start to develop those and share those out in the world?
So there, I do get accused of being too philosophical and too academic, which I can see totally why that's the case. I try to a lot of what I've done is born out of practice, but maybe in how I explain it, sometimes it sound too academic or too philosophical. At the end of the day, the goal here is to go to first principles and understand what's the root of what we're trying to accomplish. If we can understand that in a more fundamental model-based approach or a mental model that people can embrace, then a lot more things make sense. And so, the practicality of a model. A model is not practical until it's put to use. And at the end of the day, if it can be put to use, then the tactical execution of whatever people were hoping to do becomes hopefully more explainable, more rational, more logical in many different ways. So anyway, but the models that I've created, whether it was the cyber defense matrix or the DIE Triad, were really born out of like intense frustration with the status quo, right? Around why we're doing it this way. Isn't there a better way to do this? So the cyber defense matrix originally was born out of intense frustration of just talking to hundreds of these startups and not really understanding what they do because they claim to do pretty much all the same things, right? And that didn't help me make any sort of good decisions on what products I should look at or where I have shortfalls. And so the cyber defense matrix, for those who don't know it already, I'll explain visually. I'll try to explain what it is in your visual mind. So it's five. It's the five functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Think of those as verbs, paired up against five asset classes: devices, apps, networks, data, and users. Think of those as nouns. So the five verbs and the five nouns end up with a 5x5 bingo card. At the bottom, I have this changing degree of dependency on people, process, and technology, where process is consistent throughout, but there's more technology in the first functions of identify, protect. And then as you go to detect, respond, and recover, it tends to weigh more towards people. So this matrix was a mental model that I used when I talked to vendors to say, okay, tell me what you do. And I visually put them in my mind, I put them in a certain box. And the simple activity of putting them into the box is sort of like what's called a memory castle. Actually, that's not the name of it. It's there's a memory palace. Yeah, it's called memory palace, where just by having a visual recollection of where things fit in your house, for example, you have a better way to recall information. So I use the same sort of technique, but using the 5x5 matrix to say, okay, I'm talking to a vecto. Okay, where do they fit? Actually, I don't know if it's called a vector anymore, but where do they fit in the cyber defense matrix? Once I know where they fit, then all the things I heard about this company come back to memory, and I can then recall the nature of the company. So people accuse me of having an encyclopedic memory of all these vendors. I actually don't. I just have a nice system of organizing content. So that became a really useful tool. And again, it was born out of frustration of not having something better. And so the mental model was useful in that regard.
Yeah, I think the thing I really like about it is that, you've got that kind of simplification of here are the things that we care about, here are the things that we do, kind of on your X and Y axis there. But there's that phrasing that we hear so often that complexity is the enemy of security. Yet when it comes to like frameworks and methodologies for, dealing with security, they're so vastly complex that, they can be dozens, if not hundreds of pages long with all kinds of appendixes and add-ons. And you've got this great concept of let's have something that you can actually have in your mind that really cuts through all that and simplifies it. And okay, what is it that we care about? What is this thing doing here? And then kind of where does it lean on that technology to people scale? Now, you developed that a few years ago. Is that something you've continued to think about and challenge? Is it still standing up fairly well in your opinion?
Yeah, so I first came up with it about 10 years ago, 2015, and then I presented it publicly in 2016. And since then, and then, it was an initial adoption, but at this point in time, what I'm actually really surprised by is which community is embracing it more than others. So, coming out of Bank of America, of course, large enterprise, whatnot, I initially thought that it was well suited for enterprise. But it turns out actually it's MSPs that are adopting this at scale. And I'm actually shocked because I originally was thinking, well, I mean, I don't know if this would work for smaller organizations that, don't have the kind of budget or the kind of problems that we have. But it turns out, at the end of the day, the cyber defense matrix is a communications tool. It's a tool that helps organizations communicate to their stakeholders. Here's the nature of our program at a 50,000-foot level. And MSPs struggle with this when they're trying to convince a small, medium-sized business, hey, this is why you need cybersecurity. Here's what you're getting from us. Here's where you lack coverage. And if a MSP can deliver something like that in a really simple 5x5 grid to a customer, it turns out they understand it. They get the insight that they need to say, yes, let's move forward with that. And so MSPs have found this to be the cyber defense matrix to be a really, really useful communications tool for their stakeholders. And I've seen actually pretty broad adoption across thousands of MSPs in this front. So I'm pretty happy with that outcome. It was wholly unexpected, but one that I'm delighted about because that group definitely needs a lot of help.
And in terms of that shift, because you've got the kind of curve there between technology and people, has that held fairly true in your opinion, or have we started shifting into greater use of technology across all those processes?
Great question, and one that I still test on a regular basis to see if that hypothesis is still correct. And so far, it's actually held up, even in the face of AI. Although we'll see how AI unfolds over the next couple of years, but the perspective that we still have a heavier dependence on people on the right side of the matrix towards the detect, respond, recover continues to be the case. And there's a old article called "The Ironies of Automation," which kind of basically make the same point that the more that we automate, the more we end up depending upon people for this interesting reason that this paper talks about. So anyway, the point is that it still holds up to be true, and even conceptually, it holds up to be true because at the end of the day, you have people who are trying to circumvent the technology controls that we have, and once the technology controls have been circumvented, and we're in detect, respond, recover, well, you kind of have to rely upon people to help you get out of that hole. So that's the current situation that will remain. Now, again, with AI, if AI breaks in, then I suspect that we'll actually still have AI help us in some capacity. But I think at the end of the day, we'll still be relying heavily upon people to accomplish those tasks.
Yeah, no, so I think it's really interesting how kind of there was an assumption that it would shift faster than it has done in some of those areas, but there's still very much that people dependence there. One of the things you hit on as well with this was when you mentioned you were talking to vendors, and it's really hard to cut through the hype and the noise, and we're in this industry where every day it feels like there's new acronyms, new threats, new terminologies being coined. And actually it's really confusing the way we often use language and describe technologies and solutions and vendors out there. What do you see as the challenges and the best way to cut through some of those in terms of the confusion around the words we use in the industry and how we describe things?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the notion of models and the mental models. These mental models that we have really help cook through a lot of the confusion that we see in the market. And the models themselves have words that we attach to them, but if you can recognize the model structure, then the structure helps us process this through. So I'll give you an example. So one of my favorite mental models is what's called the DIKW pyramid: data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. DIKW. And so data is at the bottom, information above that, knowledge above that, wisdom above that. Now, the words data and information, yeah, I mean, a lot of people consider them synonymous, right? But let's just not worry about the semantics of it, but just the understanding that you have this layer at the bottom that we call data, but think of that as like the most raw atomic content. And then above that, you have some abstraction of that, some analysis of that, some metadata on top of that, and then the next layer, which we call knowledge, to be metadata on top of that, or some abstraction of that. Okay, so you have this model, and what the model suggests is that we should treat each of these layers as a whole new thing that requires an examination of that thing in its own right. I'll give you. I'm going to come back to the DIKW pyramid, but let me use an analogy that maybe many people would be familiar with, like the OSI model. You have layer 1 through 7. If I'm trying to deal with a layer 7 issue, like DNS, or trying to block Facebook.com, trying to do it at layer 3 and 4 just simply will have problems. We'll have problems in trying to block Facebook by blocking it at the IP address level. Okay, so now let's go back to the DIKW pyramid. We have content at this data level, at this lowest level. And what we have is these AI systems now that operate not at the information level, but at this knowledge level. Okay, 2 layers abstracted away. Okay. And earlier we're talking about bias in AI systems, and we're trying to remove bias out of this knowledge system that we have created. But this knowledge system is 2 levels away from the data. Okay. And when I say 2 levels away, so I would say the data, you have the data, and then you have the information is just, it could be the classification of that data. It could be the aggregation of that data. But then the knowledge system is synthesize that and infer topics and things from it. Okay. So if the goal is to remove bias out of this knowledge system, well, one approach is to say, let's go remove biased data. But the problem with that is we're solving the problem at the wrong layer. And if there's been plenty of studies on this, where if you remove biased data from a model, the model actually becomes more biased. Okay, it actually undermines your goal. And it's think of it as the way I visually describe it is, think of it this pyramid where you're squeezing this data at the bottom, you're making it smaller. And of course, the top of the pyramid shrinks as well. It becomes smaller as well. Your knowledge system becomes smaller and less useful, and as I mentioned, more biased. So fundamentally, this mental model, we have these words that we use like data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and they can again be semantically similar. But if we can understand that these are that the model creates a need for us to think about this as a new type of problem that requires new types of controls and new types of approaches, and that's essentially what we see with AI. These models help us recognize that we may also be tackling the problem at the wrong layer, and so we'll say, hey, we need better data governance for our AI systems. That's like saying we need better layer 3 blocking for a layer 7 problem. Okay. And again, I'm calling even using the word layer 1, 2, 3 tells you, wait, why are we, whatever label you put on layer 3 and layer 7 doesn't really matter. What we can recognize is we have a layer 7 problem and we're trying to tackle it with layer 3, and that's a problem. With the DIKW pyramid, we have a layer 3 problem, a knowledge problem, and we're trying to tackle it with layer 1 controls, and that's not going to work.
And in terms of those problems of, you've got data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, you founded or co-founded Knostic in 2023 and joined as the CTO. What was the problem that you were setting out to solve there in terms of those layers?
Yeah, so the main problem that we're trying to solve there is to understand, what does access control look like at the knowledge layer? So we know what access controls look like at the data layer. It's, you have direct permissions or permissions to a file, permissions to a folder, whatever else it is. The layer above it is maybe like permissions granted based on classification. Hey, this is sensitive or confidential. You either have or don't have access to that. But at the knowledge layer, it's not based on permissions at a file level or classifications of content. For anyone who's been in the national security space or the military, it's similar to saying, look, you may have a secret clearance, but that doesn't grant you need to know. And the term need to know, I think, is very apropos here, in that a knowledge-based system, what you get access to is based on your need to know. Unfortunately, most LLMs today operate on a one-size-fits-all need-to-know model. Either everyone gets to need to know about something or nobody gets to know about something. So if you go and ask about biological weapons, nobody gets to know. But if you're a CRISPR researcher, maybe you do have a need to know. So how do you give large language models discretion? Okay. And the answer is you need to give them a need to know policy. And so that's fundamentally what Gnostic is working on. We're creating this new way of understanding need to know that we can then supply that to large language models. But need to know is something that it serves as the foundation for all access policy, if you think about it. Like if you go look at the fundamentals of access policy, it's dictated based on the principle of need to know. But we've never actually formally captured that anywhere. And what we're doing is just we're systematically capturing that and then using that as a basis to then say, are these accesses correct? And how do we ensure that the LLMs that we are using follow guardrails that are tied specifically to the person or the role that they have so that they get information that fits their need to know?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting area to be in because obviously there's the kind of the big problems, like you say, we don't want AI teaching people how to make biological weapons or do horrible things. But actually at a basic organizational level, when you're plugging an AI assistant into your, financial data HR system, it can not only answer questions about how well sales are going in a particular region, but it might also say, how much is the CEO paid? Or, how much did this particular deal come in for, this other person in the organization? Information that you, like you say, is on a need to know basis, but there's no differentiation there. I guess one of the fundamental challenges around this is with just general identity security and RBAC and things like that, organizations often struggle to right-size users in terms of permissions, privileges, and access. And that problem is then exponentially greater when it comes to like which pieces of knowledge do they need access to, especially if those aren't properly tagged and identified. What are some of the ways you think about that broader problem and actually right-sizing a particular user?
Actually, in terms of the level, the size of the problem, going back to the pyramid again, the knowledge is higher up in the pyramid. In terms of the value of knowledge is much greater. I always thought, why is the knowledge part of the pyramid smaller? And one way to think about that in terms of the type of accesses that we are having to struggle with, the decisions that we need to make around access at the knowledge level is actually much simpler and much more intuitive from a business context than accesses at the data level. At the data level, there's millions and millions of little rules that we have that says James has permission to this particular file or this particular folder or this particular server. And those permissions are expressed for machines to understand. And of course, we as humans were like, why does James need access to the server? What's the business reason for that? And we don't know. We have to conjure that up. We have to figure that out. But if I said James has need to know for layoff information, that's much easier for me to grok and process and say, wait, why? Well, that doesn't make sense if you're not in HR, right? If you're in engineering, it's a very clear, the business decision is pretty clear on what to make of that. Now, that decision translates into many, many, many little bits of specific accesses at the data level or at the information level. And so I think the volume of access decisions actually is much, much, much greater at the data level, but it becomes much more more condensed at the knowledge level, which I think is our saving grace when it comes to how we think about identity and access management in the AI age. I think it simplifies it because it has this built-in business context that we all understand.
So in effect, in the future, you could see it actually being a more effective approach to only broker the information through the AI versus giving people access to the raw data or the information layer. You just give them access to that knowledge layer and let them query it and use that as the control plane.
Yeah, so let's go back to the model again, the DIKW pyramid. Back in the day when all we had were databases, people accessed the database directly. They ran SQL queries. Then we wrote applications on top of that database. What that meant is we control access to the application and we remove database level access for the vast majority of people. There's still going to be some admins who get access to the database level, but you can simplify the permission structures at the database level, because people don't need that direct database level access anymore. So now we have this application, but guess what? We now have this new abstraction on top of that, these LLMs. So that pattern should repeat itself. We could, in theory, remove a significant amount of the accesses at the application level, as long as we can control it at the knowledge level. And people will naturally want to use that mechanism to find content at the lower levels, because it's just a more intuitive, natural system. So anyway, that progression, hopefully I don't have to convince anyone about these what the future holds, because these models basically tell the whole story, right? Is this correct or not? The model itself tells the story. And if you believe it's not correct, then offer a different model, right? Or tell me where the model itself is incorrect, because the model kind of leads to its own conclusions. And that's where, I want to emphasize this notion of the models being really a key way of thinking. And that's actually been, I think, for me, the key to my success in just how I think about the world and the kind of things that I've contributed to the community. It's really, how do you take these models and apply it to our world, so you can see the world in a different way, and a better way that it makes it a lot more explainable and rational as well.
It's a fascinating way to look at it, and I think it's been really valuable. And the comments earlier around that, the way you see the world, and as a kind of a philosopher, and very much in a good sense, that you're challenging the status quo, the way people think about it, and offering them new ways to think about it, which unlock that kind of Socratic method of, we're not giving you all the answers, we're just giving you a mechanism to think about it and approach things differently. And thinking through your career, you've gone through from those help desks into the consultancy world, into the large organizations as a disruptor, and most recently, becoming a co-founder of a company. What's been the biggest difference you've noticed in moving into this co-founding role and actually being a disruptor of your own company potentially?
Well, anybody who rises up to leadership also recognizes this too, and it's a blind spot that we all have, which is the words that we say carry more meaning when you're a founder than when you're an employee. And your team is trying to work as hard as possible and trying to make sure that you get that they're that you're happy with what you're wanting them to do. But any leader who doesn't recognize that their words carry significant weight and can be misinterpreted very quickly is setting themselves up for lots of heartache. So I would say that's probably one thing that I've recognized, but I think I recognize it even more so as you go up the ranks. And as a founder, I mean, you can't go much higher than that, right? So the perspective of seeing it from that standpoint now helps me understand how amplified some of my words are in ways that I didn't expect, but need to be conscious of. So I would say that's the problem I see from my angle. For those who aren't at that level, my advice to you is simply dig further into what is really meant. Because the worst thing that we can do is spend a whole bunch of time building or working on something that your leader said in passing, but didn't really mean. Okay, and so seeking that clarification is something that I would certainly ask of my team. But I would say if you're on that other end of the spectrum, I think it would be beneficial for you to do that as well, and to probe for more details so that you know that you're working on the right thing.
Yeah, I think the phrase I remember many years ago someone telling me is, assume makes an ass out of you and me, which is very much the case. You can't assume that that's exactly what they meant. You need to clarify that, you need to confirm that, and actually have a conversation around that. In terms of your career as well, you were one of the earliest people on email. You were accessing the internet in the early days. You had all these things. For someone who's just starting their journey in technology, and specifically in the kind of security field today, what advice would you give them?
Well, okay. The technology field is moving really rapidly, right? So keeping up with it is very challenging. That said, that's when you're starting, that's kind of what you have to do, right, to build competency in that space. I've talked a lot about mental models and how mental models is a key aspect of things. One of the ways I learn about these mental models is by reading. And reading, of course, is perhaps the number one way to invest in yourself. So if you want to have if you want to accelerate your career growth or just yourself, then reading is going to be the number one recommendation. It's the cheapest per hour delivery of learning that you can get, because you're learning from the mistakes of others, and the books are really great resources for that. The other general takeaway I would have is, and this came from a friend of mine, G. Mark. He characterized to me this understanding of leadership, how you progress through leadership and whatnot. So he talked about it in the context of a military career. So going from different officer ranks, from officer rank 01 to 03 is based on your technical skills. So if you're starting off new, then you really progress on your technical skills. But to go from 03 to 04, it depends on your management skills. To go from 04 to 05, it depends on your leadership skills. Actually, I think I messed up the ranking. So I think it's 01 to 04. 04 to 05 is your management skills. 05 to 06 is your leadership skills. And then to get into the general ranks, 06 to and up, is dependent upon your political skills. Okay. And that has all the negative aspects that you may imagine. So just something to be mindful of. But in your early career, yes, definitely learn your technical skills, but along the way, observe carefully, read books to learn how to do both management and leadership as well.
And if anyone's looking for a book recommendation, your book, Cyber Defense Matrix, The Essential Guide to Navigating the Security Landscape, genuinely a fantastic read, very well reviewed. There we go. Where can people find a copy of that? I'm assuming it's on Amazon?
Yeah, you can find it on Amazon. I've yet to do a audiobook on it just because it takes time. But yeah, that's my book. And I do need to refresh it. Have to find time.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and it's definitely a great read, and anyone who's interested in learning some more about those models and the way to think about the industry, it's a fantastic place to start there. Before we wrap up, if anyone wants to find out any more information about you, the things you're up to, the models you've built out in the past, Sounil, where's the best place for them to go?
So I have a website for the Cyber Defense Matrix. It's Cyber Defense Matrix. Defense spelled the right way and the American way, with an S, not a C.
We won't hold that against you, don't worry.
But if you want to see any other things, usually you'll find me on YouTube with a bunch of videos and such. You actually mentioned this earlier, but we didn't talk much about it. But the DIE Triad actually ends up being more popular than the Cyber Defense Matrix. So I need to write something about that as well. But if you search on DIE Triad or Cyber Defense Matrix, you'll find a lot of my content out there.
Well, that's great. And really, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a fantastic conversation. And like you say, we didn't even touch on the DIE Triad or many of the other things you've been involved with. So I think we're going to definitely have to have you back as a guest on a second take and dive into some of those other areas a little bit more. As always, thanks to our super producer, Jesse, and the team at Beyond Trust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Bob.